Hi comrades and friends all around the country. Welcome everyone to this event hosted by the Search Foundation to commemorate and celebrate the centenary of the founding conference of the Communist Party of Australia on October 30, 1920. I'm Brian Ahrens. I'm a Search Committee member and a long-time member of and a former full-time worker for the Communist Party of Australia. I will be the MC tonight. I'm in the Search office in Sydney with 4 other people whom I will introduce soon. But my first task is to hand over to Millie Ingram, a local Redfern Aboriginal elder here in Sydney, who will give a welcome to country for the lands on which this office sits. Millie.
Thanks, Brian. Yes, I'm honoured to be here to give this welcome to country. It is proper protocol to give a welcome to country so people have safe passage on the lands of the Aboriginal people, and we are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. As a Wiradjuri woman, I acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of our lands. And I think it's so important that we all come together like before. I think these times we're living in now are just so horrendous. We've got a lot more work to do. So I think we need a rejuvenation of the Communist Party and what it did for us way back in the early 20s and 30s. But thank you for inviting me, comrades and brothers and sisters and cousins, at what we call them, cuz. And so it's nice to be here to meet. I hope to meet you all one day and continue to celebrate the Communist Party. And I'm happy to be here for the centenary of it. Thank you and welcome everybody.
Thanks very much, Millie. And I know that comrades and participants around the country will want to be acknowledging the lands on which they particularly are at the moment. And that's a very good tradition that is not all that long, but has now become part of Australian culture, and particularly among left and progressive people. I also want to introduce tonight here in the office Meredith Burgmann, who will launch Comrades, the book containing 100 biographies of communists. Jacquie Widin, who's the Search Vice President and who will propose a toast at the end of tonight's event, and Luke Whitington, the Search Executive Officer. Shortly, Luke will interview Stuart Macintyre, a prominent Labor movement historian that all or most of us know of. And Stuart is currently completing the 2nd volume of his history of the CPA. I especially welcome Stuart, who joins us from his home in Melbourne, just now emerging from months of lockdown. After that interview, Meredith will launch the new book Comrades, hot off the press, with the inspiring biographies of 100 communists for 100 years. Bob Boughton, one of the key main editors of the book, and whose idea the book was, will respond on behalf of the editors and compilers of the book. Jacquie will then propose a toast, and we'll conclude the celebration with a stirring rendition of the Internationale, put together by one of our members, Maurie Mulheron, former president of the New South Wales Teachers Federation, and he'll be joined in that performance by young English woman socialist singer, as she calls herself, Bethany Elen Coyle. So that will be the proceedings for tonight. Just want to say a few things. I understand that over 300 people registered for this event, and I welcome all of you all around the country. I'd like to give a special shout out to comrades in the Newcastle and Hunter region who I understand, or we understand, have come together tonight. They're all in the one place. And so give them a special shout out. No doubt others of you around the country, maybe also in smaller or larger gatherings, but in any case, wherever we are, we're joined together through the wonders of Zoom. So welcome one and all. Tonight's event has been organised by the Search Foundation, and tomorrow Search will be co-hosting with the New South Wales State Library a full day of 6 online sessions about some of the key movements and issues that the CPA and its members worked in, influenced, often initiated and played key roles in organising, planning and leading. Search has organised that event tomorrow in collaboration with the library, not only to remember a history that is all too often forgotten, hidden or ignored, but also to consider what enduring relevance those experiences have for us today, when neoliberal capitalism perpetuates and exacerbates inequality and injustice, and now even threatens the planet through catastrophic climate change. We gather tonight not only to mark the centenary of the founding of an organisation, the Communist Party of Australia, we gather also to honour and remember all those who joined that party because they shared the vision and the hope of a better society, and who struggled in the here and now for reforms and radical social changes as steps along the way to that better future world. From small beginnings at a founding conference of just 26 people in a dingy little room not far from where we are here in Sydney, there were tens of thousands of these people, comrades all, over many decades and several generations. Some of them were members all their adult lives, others for many years, and yet others only stayed a while. But they were all shaped and influenced by their experiences in the party, in tangible and intangible ways. They were just like everyone else in their different personalities, abilities, talents, and how they contributed. But they were distinguished by the fact that they were all fighters who did not accept inequality, injustice and oppression as the inevitable and unchangeable order of things. They had a go to right social wrongs through everyday struggles, campaigns and movements. They advocated for the rights and interests of workers and all those suffering forms of disadvantage, discrimination and oppression on whatever basis or for whatever reasons. Along the way, they made mistakes, as anyone who takes on big challenges is bound to do. What is amazing from the perspective of 100 years is what they got right, what they achieved, and the influence they had on Australian society and history out of all proportion to their numbers. Of course, they were part of a wider international movement of communists that shared a commitment to international solidarity as a crucial element of the struggle for socialism. But what characterised the CPA was that firstly, in the 1960s and 1970s, it rejected repressive models of socialism and committed itself to a democratic socialism in every sense, including participatory democracy in workplaces, social institutions and communities. And secondly, that the CPA supported and embraced the new social movements of the 1960s and 1970s, for women's liberation, the new emerging movement of First Nations peoples for justice and equality against their dispossession, for gay liberation, as it was then called, and in particular, the central importance of the environment, not just as an add-on issue, but as a central issue, and how true has that proved to be. The party set out to not only to outline a vision of a democratic socialism, but to make that part of its political practice. This is not the place to go into that in any detail, and I just want to conclude these opening remarks by pointing out that there are countless thousands of people that we could mention as important communist activists. The 100 in the book gives a good sense of the variety of these people, and we hope that that work will continue. There are also, in addition to the 100 in the book, there are 50 that are going up on the Search website. So the thousands of people, there are names too many to mention in any proper detail, but we can remember people such as the famous Warpies leader Jim Healy, women union leaders such as Flo Davis early on, and of course people like Laurie Carmichael, Jack Mundy, and the Green Bands that inspired so many people and showed how issues could be connected across movements. I don't want to say anything more. That is a very thumbnail sketch overview, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Luke Whitington to interview Stuart Macintyre.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for being there. My name is Luke Whitington. I'm the Executive Officer of the Search Foundation, and we have with us tonight Stuart Macintyre. Are you there, Stuart?
I am. I can't see myself to adjust the screen, but am I visible to you?
Not just yet. You're currently just a black light, but
you can hear me.
We can definitely hear you. Maybe if there's a bit of fiddling with the video settings down your left corner, you can play with that perhaps while I do a very quick introduction to you.
That's fine, Luke.
Ask you the first question. So Stuart, for those who don't know, Stuart Macintyre is not only the author of The Reds, the history of the CPA, but also Emeritus Laureate Professor of the University of Melbourne and a professorial fellow of the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. He was president of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia from 2007 to 2009 and is a life member of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. It's a real pleasure to have you with us tonight, Stuart. Thank you for being there.
Thanks, Luke.
My first question is, could you remind us, Stuart, just where and how the party began?
Sure. Before I do so, Luke, I should thank Millie for her welcome to country. I see that there are 173 of us here, and so we probably cover a large swathe of Indigenous country, and I certainly acknowledge the traditional custodians. So how did it begin? Well, the creation of the Communist Party was inspired by the Russian Revolution, although inspired might be too grandiose a term to describe the 26 persons who turned up in that dingy hall, in fact, on the first floor of a building in Liverpool Street, Sydney. The overthrow of the Tsar in March 1917, February in the Russian calendar, had been widely greeted within the Australian labour movement, and many welcomed the overthrow of the weak and ineffective provisional government 8 months later. These Bolsheviks, they renamed their party the Communist Party in 1918, calculated that their chances of survival relied on their example triggering similar uprisings elsewhere. So you had a Communist Internationale formed, made up of communist parties that sprang up all around the world. There were repeated calls to establish a Communist Party here, but it didn't happen until 1920, late in 1920, and it never had more than a few hundred members throughout its first decade.
How then did the party become something more than a tiny sect?
Well, its inability to grow and less than faithful understanding of communist policy and tactics raised the concern of the Communist Internationale in Moscow, but it wasn't until the end of the decade that the Comintern dispatched a cadre to pull the Australians into line. And by then a dissident faction, which was more doctrinaire and compromised, had seized control of the Australian party. And so J.B. Miles and Lance Sharkey were installed as General Secretary and President of the party. Lance Sharkey would take over as General Secretary in 1948. And with them and the new leadership came a rigid application of the democratic centralist model and an iron discipline that banned any dissent. Now, the new leadership took its bearings from the onset of the Depression, with Stalin's declaration that capitalism was entering a period of decisive crisis, in which the task of communists would be to unmask the traitorous reformists as capitalist agents. And certainly the dismal performance of Labor governments during the Depression gave that argument some legs. The party would grow to about 1,000 by 1931. Its work among the unemployed was most successful. And then, as a consequence, as those young activists found work later in the 1930s, they led workers in campaigns for better pay and conditions, and increasingly were elected to leadership positions in the unions as they recovered the ground lost in the Depression. Furthermore, in the mid-1930s, Stalin belatedly realised the threat posed by Hitler, and so the party pursued a united front of all workers, and soon a people's front, to defend freedom and democracy from the threat of fascism and war. And the party's movement against fascism and war contrasted with a divided and a resolute Labour Party. The party then expanded, and as it expanded, it extended its activity in the second half in the 30s to, I think, more sustained campaigns against racism and gender discrimination, and it embarked on a very remarkable range of art and literature and theatre.
That's the story you told in your book, The Reds, which went up to the outbreak of the Second World War. What about the sequel?
Well, I've almost completed the sequel, about time, I hear a number of people say, and it takes the history up to 1970. Within the limits of the book, I can't go any further, but it's called The Party. It's a title I chose partly because that was how members referred to the party, and partly in order to emphasise its unique character and the extraordinary demands it made on adherents. Now, one of those demands came in 1939 with the Treaty of Non-Aggression between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which divided Poland between them, and then Stalin's declaration that the Allies' war against Germany was an imperialist war that all communists had to oppose. That U-turn caught the Australian Party by surprise, but it accepted the new line, and its anti-war activity brought closure of the communist press, and then a declaration of illegality in mid-1940. And there's a very rich oral history of the police raids on homes and the prosecutions that followed. There were indeed communists, about 40 of them, who served terms in prison for selling or even possessing communist literature. But by international standards, it was a remarkably light repression. Eva Bacon, who came to Queensland having worked in the Viennese underground, said that the Australian Party's illegality was an absolute joke. Now, for a start, it didn't apply to communist union officials, since to raid or let alone prosecute them would have paralysed vital war industries. And then with Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the Soviets became an ally, and communists everywhere worked unreservedly for victory against fascism. And the support in Australia at this time for the Soviet Union was remarkable. In 1942, for instance, the Newcastle Jockey Club held a Racing for Russia turf meeting to raise funds for the Soviet Union, and the feature event was the Stalin Flying Welter. There were other events for Timoshenko, Dimitrov, and so on. Even more remarkable, I've found, was the assistance that the Labor government that took office at the end of 1941 gave the party. Upon restoring it to illegality, it allocated a very generous paper allowance to re-establish communist newspapers. Newsprint was then very strictly rationed, and that was to the fury of the major press proprietors. And when the party held its next Congress, every interstate delegate was provided with a travel permit. Travel permits then were as rare as hen's teeth. Union leaders such as Jim Healy and Ernie Thornton met regularly with Ben Chifley and other federal ministers. The reasons for that favoured treatment are not hard to find. The Australian Party had an industrial influence during the war, much greater than its, say, British or American counterparts. The unions that covered the maritime and rail transport, mining, smelting, manufacturing, munitions industries, all of them had communist leaders. And with an acute shortage of labour and strict wage controls, along with demands for overtime and very little in the shops with rationing, only these party unionists could keep their members working. And the party's membership rose quite dramatically from 4,000 back in 1939 to 22,000 by 1944. The cooperation extended into the early years because the Chifley government wanted no part in the anti-communist position so quickly adopted by the US and the UK, nor did Australia support those powers in their attempts to restore colonial rule in our region. Chifley in particular winked at the communist-led campaign to prevent the Dutch using this country as a base to put down Indonesia's fight for independence.
So, Stuart, when did this period of cooperation come to an end?
Well, it came to an end. The Cold War came late to Australia, partly as a result of pressure from the US and the UK in following the discovery of aspiring led by Wally Clayton, but partly because the Soviet Union turned to confrontation in 1948 when it declared the world was divided into two camps, the one of them imperialist, anti-democratic and bellicose, and the other anti-imperialist, democratic and pacific. That took the Australian party into confrontation with the Labor government, which used its quite draconian powers to defeat the miners' strike in 1949, and was followed almost immediately by the election of the Menzies government and its attempt to ban the party, this time a ban with teeth that would have jailed anyone the government named as a communist. And a referendum to give the government those powers was very narrowly defeated in 1951. So that by the early 1950s, the party was on the defensive. It had been defeated by the right in a number of unions. It was preoccupied internally with allocating blame for its disastrous left adventurism. Its principal initiative was to establish the peace movement. The peace movement was lent respectability by the peace parsons, who served as the principal office holders, although it was communists who were the full-time organisers. And accordingly, the movement failed to condemn the communist countries for their part in the Korean War, while condemning the Western powers. And that was a lopsided kind of peace movement that hampered the effectiveness from the outset. The proceedings of the Royal Commission on Espionage that was established in 1954 to exploit the defection of the Petrovs added to the anti-communist atmosphere.
Was there no discussion of the changes that had left the party so isolated?
Well, as most people who are here tonight will recall, in his 1956 address to the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's dictatorship and gave details of the crimes he'd committed. Now, at first, the Australian leaders denied the reports of Khrushchev's speech, and then they gave the most grudging concession that Stalin had erred and refused to allow discussion of those errors. And a very substantial number of members rebelled. In my view, Helen Palmer was outstanding. Contrary to popular belief, she didn't abandon the party. On the contrary, she fought for change. She didn't abandon her communist ideals. She thought this was the opportunity for the party to return to more democratic practices that would rid it of the stigma attached to its subservience to a regime that most Australians by now thought repugnant. And 1956 and its sequel also revealed a breakdown in communist discipline. Many of the dissidents who were asked to resign refused. Well, back in the past, resignation wasn't an option, comrade, you were expelled. And furthermore, many of the senior members harboured their own revisionist misgivings. And as a consequence, the growing rift between Khrushchev and Mao Zedong was mirrored here in disputes between communists who clung to the old dogmas and those who saw the need to change. The Australian Party had close links with China. That was where cadres had gone for training since 1951. And it initially sympathised with the Chinese criticisms of the Soviet revisionists. But in the end, it rejected the Chinese breach of international unity and it backed the Russians, leading to the defection of Ted Hill and his supporters, who established the small Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist. This strengthened the hand of those arguing for change. Lance Sharkey finally made way for Laurie Ahrens as General Secretary, and the substantial changes that Laurie and his colleagues introduced from the mid-60s precipitated yet another split following the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, those clinging to Soviet allegiance, broke away and formed the Socialist Party of Australia in 1971. With each wave of expulsions or resignations, there were claims that the party would emerge stronger and more unified and at last realise its socialist goal. That hope of regeneration wasn't fulfilled, although the party that emerged by 1970 was undeniably different. It no longer claimed a monopoly wisdom. It opened itself up, as Brian has said, to the new emerging liberation movements, green bans, women's liberation, gay rights. In the past, the party had supported victims of oppression, notably Indigenous and ethnic oppression, just as it supported the outcast and the homeless, but it had always insisted on the class struggle at the point of production. And that no longer defined communists from the 1970s. And I won't even attempt to tell of the subsequent events. Many here will recall them vividly.
Hope so. What conclusions have you reached in writing your book?
Well, the book is exploring at considerable length the consequences and arguments that arose from adopting a model of political action that had been devised by Lenin to deal with Russian circumstances. Russia, an overwhelmingly rural society in which peasants far outnumbered industrial workers. Russia, an autocracy that denied political freedom. The effects of the civil war that followed the communist seizure of power in 1917 reinforced Lenin's model of a vanguard party exercising absolute control over its members. But, and I think this is a crucial but, there was no proletariat left by the end of the Civil War because there was no heavy industry left. And as a result, the party substituted itself for the working class, and the dictatorship of the proletariat came to mean the suppression of other parties, and the use of terror against opponents during the Civil War sowed the seeds for the continuing use of terror by Stalin as a device of communist rule. There was little awareness, I think, of those effects among Australians who were attracted to the Soviet model and most of all to the socialist six of the world. But here, of course, there was no possibility of imposing communist discipline by force. Discipline here was self-imposed. It was part of a way of life that was chosen. Communists were dedicated, there were rules to the party because it channeled their rebellious instincts. And that combination of characteristics seems to me to run through the 100 communist lies that are gathered together in the centenary volume, Comrades. The biographical essays, I think, give a vivid reminder of the impulses that inspired these men and women to make the sacrifices they did and the qualities that enable them to achieve so much. Now, I came into the party at the tail end of the events I explore in my book in 1971, and I was able to become familiar with many of its principal figures as well as lesser known ones. Some, I have to confess, struck me at the time as authoritarian and unattractive, and doubtless they found me callow and cocksure. But I recall the overwhelming majority who dedicated their lives to human betterment with intense admiration. And I feel humble and privileged to have been able to speak about them tonight.
Well, it's been our privilege to listen to you. Thank you very much, Stuart Macintyre.
Right, thank you.
I'll now switch back to Brian, who'll introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Stuart. And as I said at the beginning, our next speaker will be Meredith Burgmann, who those of us in Sydney, and I think nationwide, know of very well. A Labor Party member, at one point the President of the New South Wales Upper House Legislative Council, and a historian, feminist, author, and many other things. And it's my privilege to introduce her to launch the book, Comrades.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I too would like to begin by acknowledging that here in this office, we are on the land of the Gadigal and pay tribute to their elders. And I'm really pleased to be part of the launch of this wonderful book, Comrades, Lives of Australian Communists. The editors are Bob Boughton, Danny Blackman, Mike Donaldson, Carmel Shute, and Beverly Simons, and it's a cracking cover by Chips Macintyre. And I understand there was a bit of a discussion about whether to have the hammer and sickle on the birthday cake, but I'm glad it got there because it was a large part of the history of the Communist Party. And I suppose, never having been in the party, but having been very close to it for a long time, you know, I was a total fellow traveller, I can really blow the party's trumpet in a way that members of the party probably feel they can't. And I want to talk about it today in really the way I feel about it. I came of political age in the late 1960s, and I found myself working with communists in every part of what I was doing. The anti-Vietnam War movement, we students, of course, thought that we invented the demonstrations, but you have to look at it from behind and see that in actual fact those early demonstrations in 1965, you know, when the communists lay down in the streets in Canberra, those early demonstrations were all led by the Communist Party. The 1971 anti-Springbok demonstrations, where would they have been without Dennis Freeney, who was quietly organising it all? We didn't even, as I say, until you look back on these things, you don't really see the hand of the Communist Party often in these things. And of course, early environmentalism without Jack Mundy and Joe Owens and Tommy Hogan and all those, that communist leadership of the Builders Labourers Federation, where would green bands have been without them? I vividly remember an incident that happened in 1968. It was the day of the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union, and there was a bunch of us down in Martin Place demonstrating against the invasion. And we decided to elect a group of us to go down to Communist Party headquarters to find out what their view on the situation was. And I was one of, I think there were 3 or 4 of us that were elected. And we went down to the old CPA headquarters in Day Street, I think it was. And we sat in a little ante-room next to what was obviously the big meeting room. And we could hear raised voices and we could hear discussion going on. And I think we waited for a couple of hours before Laurie Ahrens eventually came out and said, we have decided to oppose, that the Australian Communist Party will oppose the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And of course, I didn't realise that I was there present at a very, very historic moment, because the CPA was the first Communist Party in the world to come out against the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And it was also a moment that encapsulated what the Communist Party had become in Australia. It was a party that was in the middle of de-Stalinising. So this was the party that I knew, the party independent from both China and Russia. A party that believed strongly in alliances and united fronts, and really was not very sectarian. They might have been having their own fights within themselves, but they were very welcoming to people from outside the party. I was never asked to join the party by anyone. I was included in all their everything they were doing. And Chips Macintyre tells me he had exactly the same experience. He was never asked to join the party, but they gave him the key to the printing shop down in Forest Lodge so that he could print his posters. So that was the party as I knew it. However, I was very aware of the period that had gone beforehand, the McCarthyism of the late 40s and 50s. And I became even more aware of this when I wrote my book on ASIO, because I realised that the work of those secret intelligence agencies, Special Branch and ASIO mainly, had really totally destroyed the lives of some of our comrades, including some of the comrades written about in this book. And I was aware of the absolute bastardry of ASIO, and I might say that I think it's beginning to happen again with what's happening to our Chinese Australian citizens. So let's look at the book itself. it's a wonderful idea, 100 lives for 100 years. And I love the fact that they have chosen to have 50% women and 50% men. And the lives of the women in the book are just as vibrant and as exciting and interesting as that of the men. The authors range from 90-year-old George Zangalis to young professors, Professor Heather Goodall, Professor Michelle Arrow. And we also have, I love the chapters written by the children of the people that they're writing about. I thought Paula Ricks writing about Joan Harrison, Rex Hewitt writing about Noreen Hewitt, and Bob Makinson writing about Dick Makinson. There was a warmth and a familiarity there that was really charming to read. But all the chapters are excellent, they're informative, they're academically correct, and they're really interesting. Some were particularly poignant, and a couple that I read actually brought me to tears. The story of Aileen Palmer, who, the daughter of Vance and Nettie Palmer, she was very good at languages, and she worked for 2 years straight as a translator for the International brigades during the Spanish Civil War, and that so affected her. She ended up with really what would be called PTSD today, and it really quite destroyed her life. Another woman who I read about was Bernice Morris, who was the wife of David Morris, who ASIO had decided was a spy, and that he must never be allowed to have jobs. He was an engineer, but never allowed to have appropriate jobs in Australia. So he eventually had to leave Australia and live in China and Russia. Now, he was working for the Water Board in Tasmania, and you keep wondering what secrets was he in fact gaining that meant that he could never be allowed to work in his chosen profession. Another chapter I loved was about Oriel Gray, the stalwart, the playwright, the stalwart of New Theatre. And of course, New Theatre and that theatrical presence keeps coming throughout the book. But Oriel Gray, in 1955, she won a playwrights competition that she had to share. She shared with Ray Lawler, and his play was Summer of the 17th Style, and her play was a really wonderful play called The Torrents. But of course, we all know what happened from then on. She was really overshadowed by Ray Lawler's success. My own chapter is on Pete Thomas, who was a Communist Party member for 50 years, or 49, he kept telling me. And he wrote over 30 books and leaflets and pamphlets about things that the Communist Party wanted to have out there. They were, some of them were quite academic books, and some of them were propaganda, but boy, were they great propaganda. He took it upon himself to, I felt he was handing on the flame to me, because he kept dragging me out. He dragged me out to meet Ernie Campbell. I got to meet Guido Baraki, one of the founders of one of the 26 founders. And he certainly was one of those communists that understood the history of the party and realised that the young have to know these things too. And I think that's what's going to be one of the wonderful things about the book, that the new young progressives will know about those that went before them. As historians, we chat and gossip, and we often talk about various characters, and then we say, and I walk with 2 historians every night, and we say, I wonder if she was in the party. And we go away and look them up, and sure as eggs, that person is in the party. One of the ones we were talking about recently was a wonderful woman in Glebe called Norma Hawkins. And we thought, I wonder if she was in the party. And we looked her up, but we couldn't find her. But of course she is. She's in the book as Norma Disher before she became Norma Hawkins. And she is still fighting, at the age of 98, she is still fighting for the habitat of blue wrens and other small birds in Glebe. So, I mean, old comms never die. And it was lovely to read about some of our beloved comrades who, of course, have died, some recently like Jack Mundy, and of course, Joe Owens, and to me it was lovely to read again about Merv Nixon, who was always a great favourite of mine. And of course, those who died young, and tragically so, like Brian McGahan, the great LGBTIQ activist who just died far too young. So there were poignant moments in reading the book, but I just have to say that it was wonderful to read about the beginnings and to hear again from Brian and from Stuart Macintyre about the beginnings of the party, the 23 men and the 3 women. And you have to remember that 2 of the founders of the Communist Party in Australia were Catherine Susanna Pritchard and Christian Jolly Smith. And I was brought up being taught about Christian Jolly Smith as being, you know, the first woman solicitor in New South Wales and stories like that. So I won't go on, but many in the book make the comment that when they talk about the dissolution of the party in 1991, they say, I didn't leave the party left me. And I think a lot of us feel that way. I think we all believed that this had to happen, but it was very sad. But I like the comment that I read when I was looking at the notes of the authors, the 70 very interesting authors. And Bob Makinson says that he was in the party until 1991 and thinks we are overdue for having another go. So maybe that's what. So I'd like to, I know there's going to be a toast to the party and to the members of the party later, but I'd like to toast the terrific comrades that have put together the book. They're not only the 70 authors who have written the book, but the editors. And having been an editor, I know the hard work that went into it. So 3 cheers for Bob Bowden, Danny Blackman, Mike Donaldson, Carmel Shute and Bev Simons. Fantastic.
Well, thanks so much, Meredith. And she's just read again the names of those people on the cover of the book. And I would like to introduce one of them now to respond to Meredith's launch of the book, Bob Boughton. And I think it's best if I say this rather than Bob himself. I said it earlier, but just to say, Luke and I were in on a meeting earlier this year at which Bob suggested that this idea of doing a communist biographies book, a sort of dictionary of communists, we all reacted to it immediately as a fabulous idea. And I think the thinking was, you know, we might get 20 or so. And I have to say, one of the things that should be said about this book is what a fantastic effort it has been from the inception, the conception of that idea only a few months ago to its delivery in hard copy with 100 biographies for 100 years is an incredible achievement that Bob and all those others should take great credit for. And without further ado, I'll introduce Bob, who is joining us from northern New South Wales.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Meredith. Let me acknowledge the Gumbunja people, who are the people of the area where I'm living. I'm living just north of Coffs Harbour on the border, basically, between Gumbunja country and Bunjalung country. I want to thank Meredith for supporting the book. One of the basic Marxist principles the party taught us, Meredith, was that labour was the source of all value and that labour was a social process. And that was certainly true of the labours of love that produced the Comrades. So I want to acknowledge the many workers who actually laboured to produce it. So we've already mentioned the collective which managed the process, but they also wrote quite a few of the biographies, and that included my co-editors Danny Blackman, Mike Donaldson, Carmel Shute and Beverly Simons. But we had some other members, Bob Makinson, Margaret Penson and Scott Pointing. We were a pretty diverse group of ex-party members, so we were pleased to discover that even 30 years after the party had finished, we remembered enough of the party's training in solidarity, collective work and disciplined organisation that we got the book out in record time and we didn't actually have any major splits. So like the good Marxists we are, though, we extracted as much surplus value as we possibly could out of our workforce. Bev and Danny edited every one of the 150 bios we'd done. Then Danny worked with the Wollongong-based printers, Graham Jones and Josh Whalen, who did an incredible job at Creative Visions Print and Design to get it out so quickly. And they rearranged and finalised the book's layout. But none of this could have happened, of course, without capital. And Mike Donaldson generously advanced the capital that we needed to pay, as well as writing a significant number of the biographies. Then we got Australia's favourite political poster artist, Chips McAnally, who I see is out there in Alice Springs tuning in on this little session, to do his spectacular graphic design, which I have to mention is entitled "The Worker's Cake is Deepest Red." But I think the most encouraging, like Brian said, and exciting part of this has been that the initial idea for remembering our old comrades and their work caught the imagination of so many people. So that after thinking we might get 15 biographies finished in time to put them up on the Search website in time for the centenary, we finished up with 10 times that number, written by 100 authors from all over Australia. And some of those authors are here, many of those authors I think are here tonight. So thank you very much, comrades, for the incredible work you put in, because it was a result of a lot of work, and not just from the authors, but also the people in the state-based labour history groups who helped us find them and convince them to write, and all the librarians and archivists who helped locate photos and sources for each of them. Plus we had the Sydney Search staff, Luke Whitington and Flor Chenik, supporting us, while in Melbourne, Louise Connor and Maddie Goulet at the new International Bookshop took on the major task of marketing and distribution so we could actually realise a little bit of that surplus value. At the very least then, the project engaged about 150 people. And I think that shows how the ideas and actions of the Communist Party still remain very much a live topic today, which shouldn't really surprise us, should it? Given how even more destructive and dangerous capitalism is proving every day, and now that fascism is again rearing its ugly head. So I think the aim now is to get as many copies of this book as we can into the hands of the activists in today's social movements, so they can learn some of this hidden history, criticise it, yes, but also feel some of the inspiration and hope and solidarity that the CPA provided us as its members, and I think also, as Meredith said, to its fellow travellers. We're not pretending, of course, the communists of the past had all the answers to today's questions, but the CPA's successes and mistakes, which you'll see played out in the lives of the comrades in the book, can still teach us some important lessons. And most importantly, I think if they could achieve all that they did in the 20th century, there's every reason to believe, maybe if we take Bob Makinson's advice, that we can keep doing likewise in the 21st century. Thanks very much.
Yep.
Great, thanks, Bob. That was terrific speech. I now want to hand over to Jacquie Widin, who is the Vice President of the Search Foundation and a former CPA member, to speak briefly and move a toast to celebrate the centenary, and after that we'll wrap up the proceedings with a rendition of the Internationale.
Great, thank you, Brian. Thank you for all the previous speakers. It's been fantastic to hear about all the work that's being done by Stuart and by our own comrades and members of ex-members of the party. So comradely greetings to you all. I have the great privilege to propose a toast for the centenary celebration of the formation of the CPA. I'd just like to say a few words to you to introduce the toast. This will give you a chance to make sure that your glass is full. Ours certainly is. Okay. So my involvement and membership of the CPA was one of the most significant events in my life. It was late in the life of the CPA, but fairly early in mine. I was a young activist in the environmental and Aboriginal land rights movements, and through this activism met CPA members who not only had a great impact on me, but also are my lifelong friends. In particular, I'd like to mention comrades Jeff Evans and the late Kim Back and Marilyn McCormack, who Jeff and I wrote about in the collection of stories of comrades. The activists that I met and, you know, it was too many really to list, like Brian has said, showed a depth of thinking, political style, which was really encouraging and engaging to young activists like myself. And also they were full of hope for a better world. I recall Joyce Stevens, a wonderful comrade who I'm sure you all know, and I'm sorry this is a bit Sydney biased, my talk, but Joyce saying that there was a perspective, a sort of perception that communists were Machiavellian types, you know, that was out there in the world, but really what she said, and I think this is very true, that communists were people who believed that there could be a better world. Joyce Stevens, along with Gloria Garton and Margot Moore, were key to my work in feminist services. They worked tirelessly to establish these services in a fairly sort of hostile world. I'm sure Meredith remembers that work. I had a role in those services, working in them, but also as part of a group of comrades who worked hard to unionise the services. There are too many, as I say again, CPA members to list who are, you know, significant in all of our lives. It's such a pity that we cannot meet face to face to share these stories at this time. The stories of solidarity, struggle, and of course fun. The stories would show how party members could integrate struggles, to show how race, class, sex, and of course the environment are related. Also stories of movement building, as people have said, and stories of how we look forward to change. And so this is what I believe brings us together tonight and tomorrow, the desire to move forward, to take the legacy of our comrades, past and present, to encompass our foundation of socialism, which embraces new ideas and forms of activism, new forms of activism, for a better, fairer, ecological, sustainable society. So what I'd like us to do is to toast to the future and to the history and to the recent present of what being in the CPA represented for us, to struggle, to fight against and defy injustices. So please raise our glasses.
Cheers.
We'll drink to that.
Plastic doesn't have the
Comrades.
The
The
comrades.
To comrades.
Past and present
And future.
and future.
Bringing Bob's word into life. Thank you.
Luke, have you got the Internationale on?
Yes, did you want to wrap up before I play that?
Yeah, yes, I'm going to.
Yep, ready to roll.
Okay, comrades. Well, thanks to everyone who's contributed tonight. There's much more to be said. For those of you who can join us tomorrow, you should all have received the link. It's via the New South Wales State Library website. If you have any problems, get in touch with Luke and he can resend the link to you. And in keeping with what Jackie has just said, in each of the 6 sessions tomorrow on different aspects of the CPA's work in a variety of different movements, in each of those sessions, we've asked a young or younger activist from today who's never in the CPA to respond to the discussion of the history of the involvement of the party in those various movements, talk about today's issues and what that history might mean to them. And I think Jackie hit it right on the head when she said, you know, we want this to be future forward-looking, as well as honouring that past that we're all so proud of and still experience in our own lives. We'll conclude with the Internationale, and I'll just repeat what I said earlier. This has been specially recorded for us by our member, Maurie Mulheron, who, in addition to being long-time president of the New South Wales Teachers Federation, is a highly accomplished folk singer and musician. And he and Arthur Rorris, the Secretary of the New South Wales South Coast Labor Council, they have put together a 30-minute segment at lunchtime tomorrow, but they've also recorded with this very talented young woman singer in England, Bethany Elen Coyle, this version of the Internationale, which is which is the Billy Bragg version, the modern rewriting, which Maurie tells me was stimulated by a comment that Pete Seeger made to Billy Bragg, that the words were in fact, this is the old Pete Seeger talking, but he was aware that the words needed updating in light of modern times. And I believe that in the video we're about to play, those words will be coming up. So from your homes and wherever you are around the country, you should be able to join in. Please join us over the weekend. Once you register, you can come to 1 or 2 or all sessions for the whole day, whatever you wish, and I'm sure you'll find it interesting. Without further ado, Luke, I'll throw it to you to play the Internationale.
All victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no rights. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. Let no one build walls to divide us, walls of hatred, no walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. We'll live together or we'll die alone. In a world poisoned by exploitation, those who've taken now they must give. And in the vanity of nations, we've but one earth on which to live. So come brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. And so begins the final drama, in the streets and in the fields. We stand unbowed before their armor, we defy their guns and shields. When we fight, provoked by their aggression, let us be inspired by like and love. For though they offer us concessions, change will not come from above. So come brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. The international ideal unites the human race.
Amazed at how good the
It's a stunning
Danny
achievement.
Blackman must have just
I know
to
she was
the
just
buttock.
on the
She
case.
does
on
love-
the case.
She does love copy editing though.
Thanks,
She's
comrades.
a real.
That's the end of the meeting.
Bev Simons did a huge amount of work.
Thanks, Millie. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.
Well, I think also
Thanks, Meredith.
it
Thanks,
was one of
Jackie.
those.
And thanks, our photographer,
Comrades.
Michelle.
Comrades.
Don't forget Michelle, our photographer. Thank you. See you tomorrow, comrades. The link is on the website. It's in the chat. See you tomorrow. 9 o'clock sharp.
I have